You know, there are certain things in my life that I have found to be a continual struggle for me. That as hard as I push against them, the fight is never over. The fight is never over. Whether it's my temper or my appetite, the fight is never over. Sometimes I think we can get caught up on the fact that there's so much stuff that we struggle with and so much stuff that we have to fight against that we think that God can't use somebody like me. That God uses people who have their stuff together, not people like me. And tonight I want to share something with you. It's a passage that's always spoke to me. Because it confesses a truth that's not just true of the individual who speaks it, but of God more generally. A principle of how He works throughout Scripture and how I think He works in our lives. In 2 Corinthians, Paul is talking about some of the great visions he's had, the experiences he's had to this church. But he ends that line of thought here in verse 7. He says, "So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from being conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But He said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness.' Therefore," Paul says, "I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." You see, we don't know exactly what this torment that Paul had was. There's lots of different theories, and we could spend a whole hour trying to talk about which one, what theory is more likely. But the point is that Paul is not perfect. He's struggling with something. He prays to God. He says, "God, I don't want to deal with this anymore." He says, "I've prayed to Him 3 times about it." And God says, "My grace is sufficient. My grace is enough. My power is made perfect in weakness." If you think about the kind of people that God uses throughout Scripture, it's not people who have it together. When he calls His people out of Egypt, one of the first things He says about them is they are a stiff-necked people. He doesn't choose people who have everything together, who have no faults. He chose David, the least of his brothers, not only to kill a giant, but to be a king. He chose Mary, a young girl of very little import, to bear a son that would save all of us. He chose Moses, a nobody Israelite who was a murderer, who couldn't speak well to lead His people. God chooses and uses imperfect people. The difference is our God is able to use that weakness, to use our imperfections, use us in spite of those imperfections. And not only that, I love what he says to Paul here, that my grace is sufficient for you. I would love for God to just take away the things that I struggle with. I would love it if I no longer had to keep control on my tongue. But God says, my grace is enough. That means 2 things. One, it means I should understand that I don't get to get lazy in faith. I should also say that if you're in that struggle, my grace is enough. You might trip up, you might fail, but my grace can cover that. And so tonight I want to encourage us to talk about, to understand that it's okay that we don't have it together. God can still use us. Maybe you feel like tonight that you've been in a place in your life where you didn't know if you were going to be useful to God or not. I can tell you for certain He has a use for you in His kingdom. He has a use for you in His kingdom. Maybe you are afraid to let people know what your weaknesses are. Maybe you're afraid to confess that you're struggling with something. Paul wasn't. And in fact, God says, my power is made perfect in weakness. And Paul says, I will boast. I will boast in my weaknesses. I am content with my weakness, the insults that I receive, the hardships that I go through. Because when I am weak, then I am strong. It is through our weakness that God is glorified. We can see His power work in us. So tonight, if you're in either of those two places, this is the time. Maybe you've not confessed your complete weakness before the power of sin and asked for the saving power of Jesus. If you need to be buried with Him in baptism this evening, this is the time for that. If you have any need, would you come as we stand, as we sing?